Okay, so now welcome back to the second panel of our day conference on the topic of literature and art. The first speaker of this panel is Dan Georgakas, director of the Greek American Studies project at the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies, Queens College, City University of New York. Dan is the editor of the American Journal of Contemporary Hellenic Issues, executive editor of the Journal of Modern Hellenism, and a bi-weekly columnist for the National Herald. We all know that Dan has written and spoken extensively about Greek America. His talk has the title Harry Mark Petrakis' Novels, Chronicle, the Greek War of Independence. Dan, it is my pleasure, it's our honor to have you here. Please, the screen is yours.
Okay, I'm afraid I don't have any visuals, so you just have to put out my talking. Harry Mark Petrakis is known for being a Greek-American novelist. That's what his theme comes from, and justly so. However, he wrote two novels about the Greek War of Independence. And I think in some ways they are some of his finest writing, and they have almost no critical comment about them. You can look for interviews, you can look for reviews and so forth. There's hardly anything about it. Now, I happen to have some knowledge of these books because very luckily in 1976, I spent a weekend with Harry in his house in Indiana, and we talked about all aspects of writing and what he tried to do and what have you. And through the years, we continued that relationship. And I never edited any of his work, but I often talked with him about novels and so forth before they were published. I don't think I influenced him very much, but I helped him to clarify where he was already going. So a lot of what I'm going to say is based on what he told me and the attitudes I think he had. Most people don't know that when he was 11 years old, Petrakis came ill with tuberculosis, and he spent 2 years in bed. And he was a voracious reader. He's told me he read at least one book a day. So 2 years, a book a day, and he read the entire American canon. So if you want to talk about Moby Dick or Nathaniel Hawthorne and so forth, this Greek-American writer knew about them. But he was more influenced by the realistic schools of the 1930s. And people may be surprised. Nelson Algren was one of his favorite writers. He liked to read a Singer because of the ethnic quality, and he had a certain respect for Farrell and others. And what those people have in common, of course, is they write about ethnic societies from the inside, and they tend to deal with folk stories in the common people rather than the elite. So it's not like Thomas Mann or even Leo Tolstoy. Because of his illness, he never finished high school, and had a hard time for 10 years trying. He wanted to be a writer to try and get something published and so forth, and he very slowly came to the conclusion he had to write about Greek America. That's what he knew about, and he said that's what made Algren good. That's what made Singer good, and so forth. So he finally broke through after 10 years of writing with the Atlantic Monthly. And the Atlantic Monthly published Pericles on 31st Street. It was the first time a story about Greek Americans written by a Greek American published in the National Magazine. And he was just overjoyed. He was just overjoyed because he wanted to be a popular writer. He wanted to reach a mass audience. He became ecstatic when Hollywood wanted to make it into a made-for-television movie, and he went to Hollywood. And he would end up in Hollywood 3 times. And I would say that what he learned in Hollywood was the kind of writer he did not want to be. Not the kind of writer he wanted to be, the one kind of writer he didn't want to. Now, the first experience with Petrakis was fairly successful. He dealt with San Peckinpah, and they pretty much followed what he wanted to do. But he immediately discovered that writing for the screen was different than writing a novel. You didn't get the voice. You didn't get to control the material. Directors got in the way. Producers got in the way. Actors got in the way. And they may expand the work, but they change it. It's no longer the voice of the author. He also realized that in film, silence is very important. The close-up is very important. Well, he doesn't write that way. He writes folklorically. Kurt Vonnegut said his character is like 16 feet tall. So he realized he didn't fit into that milieu. They offered him a contract to write 4 more stories for television, but they weren't about Greeks, and he left. He went back to Chicago. In Chicago, he wrote his first novel, which he always felt wasn't his best, and didn't like to talk about it too much. But he'd worked in a steel mill and so forth, and he put all that in there. But it was good enough for Hollywood to want to make a movie out of it. So they brought him back to Hollywood. And this time he talked with, he was working with Frankenheim. Same thing as the first time, that first of all, the people who were going to make that movie had made Marty, they'd made 12 Angry Men, they made Requiem for a Heavyweight. So Petrakis really thought, this is what I want to do. I want to reach a mass audience with stories about working class people. Well, the television show collapsed. The market, it closed, so he didn't get to see, so it was not made. But again, he worked with the director, and he again saw the problems that being a screenwriter was. But they got him a contract to write a film about Nick the Greek, a famous gambler. And he was pretty happy about that. Petrakis had his own severe gambling problem, almost ruined his life. And he wanted to put that into that film. He also had a very, very negative view of the mob and of Los Angeles. And he wanted to show also that Nick the Greek, the gambler, had certain ethnic dimensions to him that were different than, say, Jimmy the Irishman. And he started writing the script. And again, the director was okay, but the excuse me, the other part of the creative team kept wanting to change things. They wanted Nick the Greek to just be a good and evil story. If you are a gambler, you're going to have a bad end. And they wanted to glamorize Los Angeles. Glamorize Las Vegas. Rather, you could make it a little rough, make it exciting, but don't make it heinous. And Harry just couldn't stand it, and he left. He went back to Chicago, even though he had this very lucrative contract with this company. He then wrote some books, and he had his big hit. I always want to say Lion in Winter, but it's not Lion in Winter. A Dream of Kings. A Dream of Kings came out and was a national bestseller. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I think, 13 months. Book of the Month Club, national book nominations, praise from lots of writers and so forth, and of course, an invitation to go back to Hollywood. And in Hollywood, they wanted to make a blockbuster. And what they did, they thought the main character in this novel, Leonidas, was like Zorba the Greek. And so they wanted to have a very primitive person from Greece, kind of overwhelmed by American society, making all kinds of silly gestures, but dancing and singing. And of course, Harry was appalled because he thought his Leonidas was a Greek American. He was as much a Greek town, Chicago's Greek town, as he was of the old country. And yes, he was not educated, but he was smart. And he had many insights. And there's a very sensitive part of the book in which a young boy comes to him who's been masturbating, and his mother wants him cured. And the reaction between Leonidas and this kid is very sophisticated. He's very modern and what have you. So there was that tension. The company finally, the company was so crazy, they wanted Paul Newman to play Greek. And Paul Newman said to Petrakis, "How can I play Greek? I don't know anything about it. I don't look like a Greek. I can't dance, I can't sing, can't do anything else." So they ended up with Anthony Quinn. And Anthony Quinn simply wanted to repeat the character of the film Zorba the Greek. And for him, yes, Zorba was a primitive, Zorba was this, Zorba was that. It didn't have much to do with Greek America. Petrakis wanted more about women in the film. He wanted Irene Pappas was hired to be the wife, but they just gave her a few scenes to sort of make it Greekish. But Harry wanted to make it a real character, and he wanted Greek town to be part of the character. And they fought and they fought and they fought, and at one point, Anthony Quinn says to him, I'm more Greek than you are. And Petrakis says, no, there's something wrong here. And he left. They broke up the contract, and they left. He went back to Chicago. So he saw that if you were in corporate film world, you did not have a voice, you could not choose your topic, you could not be individualistic very well, et cetera, et cetera. And he then decided, I'm going to focus on being Hellenic. And in 1968, he made the trip of his lifetime. He went to Greece for the first time. And it was a very traumatic, wonderfully traumatic experience. He spoke with wonder. One day he walked into a museum just north of Omonia Square, and it had all the revolutionaries of 1812 and of 1821. And he identified with them. Suddenly he said he just had a feeling for them that he never had for American Revolution, the Civil War, or anything else. And he was not naive. He knew they could be cruel. He knew they could be evil. He also knew they took on the biggest regional military power and won. And he was just so thrilled, and he wanted to write about this. And he knew he didn't know very much, so he started traveling in Greece. He went to various historical sites, and he saw that many of the things that he'd been told as a kid were impossible. You know, a flag coming out of a window, which was like 2 feet off the ground, so it couldn't exactly stir anybody. and things of that nature. And he returned to Greece many times later, visiting all the various historical sites. He also went to visit the grave of Kazantzakis. And he had a very interesting relationship with Kazantzakis. He liked the books, he liked the writing of Kazantzakis, but basically he liked the personality of Kazantzakis. He read all the biographies of Kazantzakis he could find, and he was always thrilled to see how Kazantzakis would lock himself up for hours and sometimes days, writing in a creative frenzy and not caring who he offended, not caring what he had to say, but searching for, quote, the truth. And it inspired him. And he said, I'm going to be like Kazantzakis in that sense. I'm going to have his spirit. I don't necessarily have his politics and other things. And he decided he would write a novel about the Greek War of Independence. And he immediately he was much more ambitious. He didn't realize at the time how ambitious he was. He was going to write about the whole revolution, not a couple characters, not some incidents, but the whole thing from beginning to end. Unprecedented in American literature. There is no such novel about the American Revolution. There is no such novel that's any good of the Civil War. In the Civil War, you have things like The Red Badge of Courage, which has an interesting individual and episode, and you also have the populist regional things like Gone with the Wind. But what he had in mind, and he doesn't compare himself necessarily in quality, is War and Peace. He wanted to make a book as big and as complete as War and Peace. And he realized...
Dan, I will interrupt you. Thank you. This is really exciting that we see the parallel of Harry Mark Petrakis' two novels with War and Peace. I will give you 2 more minutes to conclude because I need now to be really harsh to all the panelists so that we keep the time. Okay? You have 2 more minutes.
Okay. Well, he decided to make 2 books. He decided to write 3 books, and eventually he did write 2. He failed to reach doing the 3rd one. I think the second one, Shepherds of Shadows, is very superior to the first, and one that contains some of his best writing. But what's key to both of those books is, in his mind, he wanted them to be read by Greek Americans so they would have a sophisticated view of the War of Independence and not have this stupid idea, Turks are demons and Greeks are angels, and aren't we braver than they are? He thought that the idealists, the Kostic warriors, and the village priests were very important. And his major theme as he went along is you realize Greece had not won because of a national army. It had won because periodic, regional, continuous outbreaks, many of them by very democratically conceived groups. I'll jump forward a little bit. There are 2 pages worth
Done.
In Hour of the Bell, Kalogeropoulos visits who was a general, visits the great Greek victory. And he sees that the Greeks have gone forward and slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the fortress. And he's the commander, he's won this great victory, but he's walking around the dead bodies, and he says, what kind of nation is going to come out of this? When you unleash those kind of passions, how do you control them and make a democratic civil society? Which I think is a very interesting discourse in that film. and the book. And then the second book, there's a wonderful evocation of Lord Byron. And he understands exactly who Lord Byron is. He's a dandy, he's sexually complicated and so forth, but he's a true romantic. He has brought men, he's brought arms, and he's brought himself to Greece to fight. And he does believe that the glories of the ancients can be revived. And it's a wonderful passage. I think it's one of the best passages. I think it's the best passage about Byron you find anywhere because it's so complex. So I just want to conclude by saying that both The Hour of the Bell and The Shepherds, they're a unique contribution to Greek American literature, maybe to American literature, and I'm not sure what fits into Greek literature because I don't know what novels are, but on this topic. But I think these are two books that should be looked at and studied more carefully than they have been.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. It is, I think, a privilege that you could take interviews from Harry Mark Petrakis. Yeah, there's only a few people could speak with him, and you know the history of Harry Mark Petrakis better than anyone else. So thank you so much for your presentation of these two books that look like the War and Peace, as you said. That I like this parallel as a War and Peace, that Harry Mark Petrakis had this big vision in mind to write. And as you said, this is big literature for us, for Greek Americans, and for American literature as well. Thank you so much. Let's move on to the next speaker, Kostis Kourelis. Kostis is Associate Professor of Art History at Franklin and Marshall College. Kostis is an architectural historian who specializes in the archaeology of the Mediterranean and how it shapes modern notions of identity, space, and aesthetics. His recent fieldwork focuses on the archaeology of labor, housing, and modern immigration. His talk today is entitled Architecture, Abolition, Revolution, a Greek-American Revival, 1920s, of the American Greek Revival, 1820s. Kostis, thank you for coming, and please have the screen.
Thank you. During the first Great Migration to the United States, Greeks established numerous places of worship that embodied their aesthetic, economic, and urbanistic agency. My paper today is part of a larger project that examines Greek American churches from 1860 to 1940 in search for an immigrant agency that has been erased by the Greeks' own prosperity in the 1960s that led to great population movements from the inner cities to the suburbs, coupled by a relentless drive to build new and demolish the old. The project seeks to be inclusive of all communities. You see here all of 167 Greek communities established before 1910. Population density reveals that half of the Greek Americans lived in small communities of 100 and were scattered beyond the traditional centers of study like Chicago or New York. Their architectural expression requires an archaeological perspective. Consider that out of the 40 Greek Orthodox churches on this map of 167 established by 1910, only 5 survive today. The early history of Greek American architecture is furthermore overshadowed by the adoption of a Neo-Byzantine style, endorsed by Archbishop Iakovos, by his favorite architect W. Stuart Thompson, restorer of the 12th century Holy Apostles. Here you see Thompson's design for the Chapel of Holy Cross Seminary from 1962, and its Athenian prototype restored by the American School of Classical Studies and completed in 1957, along with the Stoa of Attalus, completed a few years earlier. And you see this is the traditional visual conflict that we between antiquity and Byzantium. The ideological radiance of the suburban neo-Byzantinism of the 1960s has eclipsed the much more nuanced urban architecture of the 1910s. The Thyranixia of St. Nicholas Church will take place in 70 days from today and officiated by the Patriarch and his visit to the US. For my own archaeological purposes, the original 1923 church, converted from an 1823 house on the left, is much more interesting than Santiago Calatrava's iconic Byzantinism of 2012 on the right. The architecture of Greek Americans has been so understudied that when Del Upton compiled the first groundbreaking study of immigrant architecture in the US, subtitled Ethnic Groups That Built America in 1986, Greeks were not among the 22 nationalities. Upton hypothesized that those groups simply used other media of expression, such as food or religion. He wrote, quote, "Some well-known and conspicuous ethnic groups, such as the Italians, the Greeks, the Poles, and the Jews, are absent. Why is that? Large urban ethnic groups evidently built little that was distinctive, but instead expressed their ethnicity through language, food, customs, religion, and social organization. A closer study of the lost early churches, I hope, will help to change this narrative. What I present today is the third of a series of case studies about Greek architectural agency. The first two are published as The Greek Communities of Harrisburg and Lancaster, a study of immigration, residence, and mobility in the City Beautiful era from the Pennsylvania History Journal, and Styles and Real Estate, the Architecture of Faith Among Greek and Italian Immigrants, 1870 to 1925, forthcoming in the book Redirecting Ethnic Singularity, Italian Americans and Greek Americans in Conversation, edited by Yorgos Anagnostou, Yorgos Kalogeras, and Theodora Patrona. I thank Maria Kaliambou for inviting me to contribute to today's conference and generating this question, which is still a work in progress in my mind. And I also want to thank specifically Alexander Kitroev and Yorgos Anagnostou, who have pretty much entirely framed for me the field of Greek American studies. I will make a pretty straightforward point and will argue it with a bunch of visual visual comparandum. The Greek Revival movement was the first national style of American architecture, dating from 1810 to 1840, with explicit connotations of liberation from monarchy, the abolition of slavery domestically, and the assistance in the abolition of slavery globally, starting with the first test case of the Greek War of Independence. Fast forward 100 years later, Greek communities inadvertently revived that movement by appropriating older American buildings for their churches. The class of buildings runs in direct contradiction to the architectural styles of Greece and the official identity of the Greek Orthodox Church in America. In the first part of my talk, introduces the Greek Revival movement of the 1820s. In the second part, I turn to the 1893 Columbian Exhibition of Chicago that serves as Greek America's first cultural engagement with American politics and culture. Here I will reflect on three intersecting spectacles: the white city itself that revived classicism as America's national style, the World Parliament of Religion that facilitated the establishment of a Greek American Orthodox Church, and finally, perhaps more interestingly, the little-known ethnographic spectacle on the Midway, choreographed by the Greek entrepreneur George Pangalo, that staged a theater of revolutionary Greek brigands. Finally, I will quickly reflect on the visual culture generated by national crises contemporary to immigration: the Cretan revolts, the 1897 Greco-Turkish War, the Balkan Wars, and the Asia Minor catastrophe that frame, and in some cases directly cause, the emigration from the collapsing Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean to the United States. I will show you a few of the neo-Greek Revival buildings. First of all, of course, the Holy Trinity in New Orleans, the first Greek Orthodox Church in the United States. The first Holy Trinity in Salt Lake City from 1905. You see the distinctive classical capitals. Holy Trinity in San Francisco from 1910. St. Basil's in Chicago, which was converted from the Anshe Shalom Synagogue of 1911 in 1927. The Church of the Assumption in Oakland, California from 1921. And of course, my favorite that began this investigation, the St. George Greek Orthodox Cathedral, Philadelphia, an 1822 Greek Revival building designed for a Protestant Episcopalian community and bought by the Greeks in 1922. So first of all, I'll make the very quick overview of what we're talking about by the Greek Revival movement in the United States. So the Greek Revival movement is a product of the Enlightenment with architects seeking to find a much more scientific foundation for architectural design. They sent the architect Stuart and Revet to Athens and produced in 1748 the first illustrations of that little known architectural style, which preceded the much better known Roman period, as we know, which had been recycled and propagated through the Italian Renaissance. Stuart and Revet's drawings, published in Antiquities of Athens, became the blueprints for many of the Greek Revival buildings. And the thing I want to stress here for a moment is the rhetorical significance of picking Greek over classical more generally, articulated in the most foundational essay on architectural theory by Marc-Antoine Loger from 1755, where he argues architecture owes all that is perfect to the Greeks, a nation privileged to have known everything regarding science and to have invented everything connected with the arts. The Romans, able to admire and capable of copying the excellent models which the Greeks had left them, wished to add something of their own, and thereby only taught the world that when the stage of perfection is reached, there is no other way than to imitate or decline. So in this thesis, Roman is bad, Greek is good, and Abbot Loger is actually presenting here a reconstruction of the primitive hut, the logic here being that the architectural language of the Greek versus Roman temple embodies a kind of visible rationality between aesthetics, engineering, and truth. So it was the main weapon through which the historicism of the Renaissance could be overcome by a much more correct style. Excuse me, let me. Now, in the United States, Joseph Allen Smith from Philadelphia is the first American to visit Greece that we know from in 1804. He's part of this Enlightenment generation. He's part of the founders of the first Art Academy, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And he's very eager on his way back from Greece by stopping to Rome in buying a whole bunch of plaster casts of ancient Greek sculptures that become the foundational collection of the Academy. And here you see those plaster casts as they exist today. Those physical material testaments of that Greek prototype, of course, became the subject of the most famous of the Greek sculptures by Hiram Powers, here known as the Greek slave, which very specifically made references to the Greek War of Independence. And I just want to point out that under the hand of this very sexualized Greek slave, we find the cross. I should also mention that, as many of you know, the rhetorical point of this sculpture was also to generate an abolitionist movement within the United States. So the African-American slave and the Greek slave were equated in this one image. Nicholas Biddle, the second American to travel to Greece, and in this case write about it, and we have his notebooks. A prominent Philadelphian becomes the head of the Second Bank of the United States. Here you see a portrait by the famous artist Sully, sitting on the Mediterranean, pondering over the Greek Sea. He hired Thomas Walter to design his house called Andalusia in Philadelphia. Most importantly, based specifically on Stuart and Revet's drawings of the Parthenon to model the Second Bank of the United States in 1816 on Greek architecture, a bank that of course collapsed. And the reason why the Greek revival and this group of intellectuals eclipsed in the 1830s is because of the presidential victory of Andrew Jackson, a populist who both wanted to crush Philadelphia intellectuals, to crush the Philadelphia banking system, but also to have no national bank. So it's a very interesting moment of why does the Greek revival end, and we enter kind of a different phase. John Haviland, one of the most important Greek revival architects, shown here in a portrait at the Metropolitan, is holding the Stuart and Revet's Antiquities of Athens on his right hand, and he's using it as a model to create the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia from 1820, now demolished. St. Andrew Episcopal Church in 1822, which he was also a parishioner. And here we see his own grave at the crypt of that church. Now, the St. Andrew's in Philadelphia is doubly important because it became the epicenter of the Philhellenic movement. We see a photograph of the church as an Episcopal church, supervised by Reverend Gregory Bedell, who was part of the Panhellenic movement to support the Greek War of Independence. His sermon delivered on this very building called The Cause of the Greeks, published here in 1827, became the important tract through which support of the Greek War of Independence spread throughout the United States. It is those kind of writings that has also inspired, as we've already heard, Samuel Howe. And here I simply want to point out that among the things that Samuel Howe did that are lesser known are his establishment of a refugee settlement, which he named Washingtonia, a settlement that survived through the late 19th century. Here are some letters from the archives of the British School in Athens that try to identify the exact nature of this refugee camp, this American refugee camp in the middle of the Corinthia, that has all but disappeared and is part of another project that I'm involved with a group of colleagues of not only locating the location of that monument, but also hopefully finding some of its material remains. You see the rock of Acrocorinth in the distance that you'll see at the very end of the talk one more time. So that's the Greek revival, which, as we said, eclipsed by the middle of the 19th century. Of course, there are no, with the exception of the very few Greeks that come to Amherst College in New England and are brought in by Howe and others, Greek immigration really begins in the 1890s. So this is the moment of 1893. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 was a landmark moment in the cultural history of the US, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' discovery. Globally, it signified that America had come of age and could host the coveted international spectacle comparable to the 1851 World's Fair in London, housed in the first industrial building, the Crystal Palace, or the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, whose Eiffel Tower topped the engineering prestige. Rising out of the traumas of the Civil War with a renewed industrial vigor, America had become an economic, although not quite yet a military superpower, centered around coal, steel, and the Western expansion served by Chicago as a midway point between San Francisco and New York. The first cultural significance lies in the boldness of its aesthetics, in the ideological stance towards history and its applicability as a national style to be repeated across every corner of the nation. Known as the American Renaissance in art, or the City Beautiful movement in architecture, the style of the Chicago World's Fair reigned unchallenged for half a century as America's undisputed national style. World's fairs in the past had invested in technology, a new power of aesthetically communicating modernity. The buildings of the Chicago World's Fair, however, were also masterpieces of engineering, which we can't see. They were built by a steel frame system invented right here in Chicago. That innovative engineering, however, was covered up by the skin of white classical ornament derived from neoclassicism, and more specifically the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, whose pedagogical model incidentally was adopted by America's first architectural schools, founded soon after the fair at the University of Pennsylvania, at MIT, and at Columbia. The uniform whiteness of the fake facades gave the fair the name the White City. Although temporary, it only lasted 6 months and seen by 27 million visitors, the designers of the fair were hired by Washington, D.C. to design the new Capitol, hence adopting this Chicago style into the architecture of the mall that replicated in civic buildings throughout the country. How is this important to Greek American studies, however, you might ask? Chicago was America's industrial immigrant capital. In 1890, 41% of its population was foreign-born, and if you add the native-born children of those immigrants, 75 to 80% of Chicago's population was the foreign stock. Greeks made up a minuscule proportion of that population, as Chicago grew to host the largest diaspora community. In 1893, Hull House and the University of Chicago initiated the first sociological studies of Greek immigration, producing the earliest empirical data on Greektown. Here you see the Natalie Walker's 1915 map of that neighborhood. The Chicago World's Fair is also, and of course, a photograph of the label as the Greek district. The Chicago World's Fair is also important for Greek American studies because it hosted the first cultural reckoning of a Greek America that sparked the foundation of the Greek Orthodox Church of North America. The Chicago World's, the one thing I want to say very briefly is that the artistic legacy of the Chicago World's Fair and the establishment of all these art schools also led to actually some almost completely unknown students of art that in fact studied within that American Renaissance. Kleoniki Damianakis is one of them. You see here her etching called The Fountain. She studied at Berkeley, and in fact in 1919 ended up designing the mural of the new auditorium of Berkeley High School. And we have also Emmanuel Caravacos, a Baltimore raised sculptor who in 1911 even got a scholarship to go to Europe, and he designed many funerary monuments in Baltimore Cemetery. We also have to keep into consideration some of the Greek entrepreneurs, like for example, the Kourelis brothers, used the style of the White City to promote their businesses. This is one of my favorite new discoveries. After trying to essentially build the backs of their baking equipment store in 1921, which collapsed, kind of trying to do it the cheap immigrant way, just hiring, the son of someone whom you know, and one of the Kourelis brothers dies. Consequently, a kind of solution and moving forward for the company was to hire the University of Pennsylvania Beaux-Arts hired trained architect Max Bernard to actually design the Kourelis Baking Company building. So you see the City Beautiful movement in Chicago has an influence on the promotion of of Greek American businesses as well. But the Chicago's World's Fair is important for Greek Orthodox religion because it hosted the World's Parliament of Religions, in which Dionysius presented the Greek Church. Present was also Panagiotis Fiambolis, the priest of the Chicago new community, who in his speech wrote, quote, the division resulted in the prevention of Christianism and the progress of Mohammedanism, whose motto is kill the infidels. Because everyone who is not a Mohammedan, according to the Quran of the Prophet, is an infidel, is a dog, the people of the Orient suffered and still suffer. The Christian virgins are dishonored by the followers of the moral prophet, and the life of a Christian is not considered as precious as that of a dog. So you see the Greek kind of anti-Turkish conservative voice presented in the company of other other members of faiths, including Islam, Buddhism, and showing the kind of recurrence of the narratives of the Greek War of Independence against Turkey 100 years later, practically. Now, out of that conference, what resulted was kind of an implicit decision that the Greek Orthodox churches in America should follow an Athenian style of architecture, and I won't say very much about it, modeled after the Theophilus Hansen's metropolis. This is a very non-Byzantine style. It's an invention of the mid-19th century. The Church of the Annunciation in Chicago of 1910 embodies that style, and from then onward becomes in some way the official church style. We even see this wonderful advertisement from 1912, where Nicholas Dokos tries to kind of promote the hiring of Greek architects wherever they might find themselves, and see at the very end, "Προτιμήσατε τον ομογενή σας αρχιτέκτονα μηχανικών." Choose a Greek architect. This is the model that is canonical in 1912. Finally, the third piece that I will try to do a little more quickly of the Chicago World's Fair kind of cultural fulcrum is not what you see here on the right in the very white architecture of the White City, but the Midway, which was the popular sort of extension where you have all kinds of forms of popular culture, entertainment, and ethnographic representations. And you see, for example, here a view of it, sort of kind of the other side of the White City. And I want to highlight the role of George Pangalo, a native of Smyrna who has a very, very interesting background, who in fact commissioned the Cairo Street and convinced the Chicago Committee to actually host a number of these ethnographic events, including hiring this actor, born in Syria, has a wonderful career throughout the Mediterranean, to embody the image of the Greek brigand. So behind the White City, we have the kind of the popular kind of reinvention of the Greek brigand, the Greek hero of independence, which I believe are framing the readaptation of the Greek revival movement of 100 years earlier. I also want to stress that if one looks also at the history of religious architecture, of Greek American art in the walls of the churches, we find the continuing insistence on a very neoclassical style of painting. Here I show you one example. This is a huge mural in St. George Cathedral by Constantine Triantafylou, a Greek-trained artist that comes to New York. You see, this is made in 1939 in exact opposition to the 1930s school in Greece that is completely rejecting this European style of representation as foreign and therefore inappropriate for a Greek national style. I love this little ad, 1921, which advertises a mural that Constantine Triantafylou painted for a restaurant in New York City. A special exhibition of interpreting Grecian art, 16 life-size romantic paintings depicting the colorful story of the fall of Troy by the eminent Grecian painter Constantine Triantafylou. I would give thousands of dollars if we could find an image of that restaurant depiction. So turning very quickly to the last phase of my presentation, I think I would argue that it is also in the milieu of the geopolitical crisis of the late 19th and early 20th century that the image of the Greek revolutionary hero began to get recycled. I will simply show you some examples of the visual culture of relief, the Near East Relief Organization, which is helping in the initially in the relocation of orphans from the Armenian genocide, and then moves its operation to Greece. I show you an image of the headquarters of Near East Relief on Broad Street in Philadelphia to illustrate how prominent the visual, the visual representation of war and crisis would have been. So I'm making a very, very vague, and I'm still trying to work this out, visual connection between the narrative style of the church icons of Triantafylou, the popular art of fundraising for the Eastern cause that propagated throughout the American landscape, which the Greeks are beginning to inhabit and capitalize on. Finally, I want to remind you that it is the American or the operations in Greece that reinstate the connections between Greek war relief. I show you in the newly built American orphanage in Syria, really rekindling connections that had been active by Panhellenic missionaries already 1820, 100 years later on the very same spot. And another example is the Near East Orphanage in Corinth, established in 1921, next to the archaeological site of Corinth, which many of you know since 1896 was excavated by the American School of Classical Studies. And you see here the orphans from that new installation spelling out. You see the little kids spelling out 2 Corinthians 1:8-11. That if we look at our biblical passage, really warns the. It's a letter that warns the Corinthians from the imminent trouble that's coming from the east. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired, even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. So yes, we persevered against the Asian threat. We persevered against the threat from the east, spelled out in this fabulous way, photographed by an airplane, of course, with the rock of Acrocorinth that I showed you earlier, only a few miles away from the initial refugee camp built by George Howe, who of course at this point had already disappeared and only existed in memory. And finally, I'll close with an image of a visit of this orphanage in the American excavations of ancient Corinth, as they admire the ruins of incorrectly attributed ancient Roman bath, but you see that sort of collapsing of national boundaries, of the revival of the call for saving the Eastern Mediterranean as the beginning of the if 1821 marks the beginning of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, 1921 marks the end of that dissolution, and that continuum requires the visual imagery that can be recycled and revived. Finally, I want to finish with only one story from the Cathedral of St. George, which, if you remember, in 1922 was bought by the Greek community as the Episcopalian Protestants were literally facilitating white flight. They realized that they were surrounded by dirty immigrants, and they had to leave this neighborhood right around the corner from Independence Hall and move to the suburbs to avoid the ethnic enclaves that were developing. But more importantly, in 1922, when the Greeks purchased that building and converted it into a cathedral, you begin to see in their letters, in their self-presentations, that they are recycling a very interesting historical prophecy almost. What do I mean by that? According to the book of Revelations, the city of ancient Philadelphia is one of the 7 churches of the apocalypse. Well, it just so happens that the city of real Philadelphia in Ala Sehir was in fact literally involved with some of the most brutal, there's an important fire, just brutal destruction as a result of the Greco-Turkish War in Asia Minor. And you read in the self-narratives of the Greek community that the Church of St. John in Philadelphia, the original Church of St. John, has disappeared, has collapsed, has died, as the St. George Church in Philadelphia is taking on the challenge, taking up the baton of the new Philadelphia to carry on this very important message that has a continuum of 100 years. And it's at this point that I just want to say we're facing the year 2022, and the Greek community of St. George is now facing a new challenge, which is how to commemorate its own 100 years anniversary. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kostis, for this truly rich and visually sophisticated talk, which combines racial politics, aesthetics, and it's for us very interesting to understand how these revolutionary ideologies influence the architectural heritage and the material culture of Greek Americans. Thank you so much. We learned a lot. So now I'm continuing to our third speaker of this panel, April Kalogeropoulos Householder. April is the director of undergraduate research and prestigious scholarships and teaches in the honors college at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her research is on the intersection of feminist media history and theory. Her dissertation included the production of a documentary film about Laskarina Bouboulina, Greece's first female Navy admiral, who made major contributions to the Greek Revolution. If we had the conference in person, we would be watching April's film at the end of the conference, and we had the opportunity to speak with April with a Q&A session. So now in this virtual format, April will give us a talk on reflections on Greek nationalism and the making of a documentary film about Bouboulina. April, thank you for joining us today. Welcome. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you to Maria and Hira and everyone at the Hellenic Studies program at Yale University for this wonderful event. Και καλησπέρα σε όλους στην Ελλάδα. I think my talk today will have a lot of overlaps with some of the things we've already heard, in particular, the presentations from this morning by Professors Ketroev and Alexiou and Georgakas, who really looked at the dominant ideologies of some of the imagery from things like Independence Day parades as a spectacle, and also as a place having potential for radical contestation over the meaning of Greek nationalism. So let me pull up my... Okay, so my talk today will begin with an autobiographical reflection on my own identity as a second-generation Greek American and how I came to make a documentary film about Laskarina Bouboulina, the heroine of the Greek Revolution. As a comparatist and a feminist, I use interdisciplinary methods to analyze texts in relation to one another from an ideological perspective, relying on the intersectional axes of things like critical race theory, feminism, modern Greek studies, historiography, and visual and literary analysis. The talk will use a comparative model to make connections between the concept of patriotism in the Greek diaspora and the misuses of 1821 by Greek nationalists. So these first images will be very familiar to most of us. Portraits of heroes of the Greek Revolution hung on the walls of my Greek Orthodox church's hallway in Baltimore. They were displayed more prominently in the reception hall each year during the March 25th commemorations of the Greek Revolution. As a child, I had always noticed two women who were among the heroes, Bouboulina and Mando Mavrogenou. What were their stories? What did they contribute? As a young tomboy, or what we might call today a gender non-conforming kid, Mando's beauty and femininity didn't interest me that much, but I was drawn to Bouboulina with her stern glare, her pistol tucked into her waist belt, commanding a ship, a woman who looked like an action hero who lived in a time that I knew nothing about. It would be many years later that I would discover what it was she was pointing to in that painting, the Palamidi fortress in Nafplion, where I'd walk the 999 steps to the top of the citadel where 300 cannons were perched atop a high wall to fight off the Greek navy, led by Bouboulina herself. When I interviewed Philip Dimertsis Bouboulis, Bouboulina's fifth generation grandson and the founder of the Bouboulina Museum in Spetses, for a documentary film that I made about Bouboulina for my dissertation, I understood what he meant when he described Bouboulina's siege of Nafplion as suicidal. Little did I know that this image would become a lifelong source for my intellectual curiosity as a graduate student, a filmmaker, a teacher, and a researcher, and now 15 years later, the subject of a collection of essays about her life and times. As a young, proud Greek American, I wondered, why don't I know much about Greek history after 2500 BC? Why do representations of Greece in America make me feel like a tourist? One with the predominant theme of sun, fun, and again, native ancient monuments. And why can't I name any famous Greek women from history who aren't mythological figures? Why isn't Bouboulina's story well known even in Greek communities? Asking these feminist questions started me not only on an intellectual journey to discover the lost histories of Greek women, but also my personal journey to connect with my Greek roots. This was my moment of nostos, my return to the Greek motherland, which led me to a small village in the north of Greece called Flamboro, where my grandmother was born, and to Spetses, an island in the Argo-Saronic Gulf near the Peloponnese, where I had fond memories as a child. In Spetses, I visited the Bouboulina Museum and met Philip, who would become a lifelong friend. In 1991, Philip founded the museum in Bouboulina's mansion that was built in the 17th century, which is now his family's home. The museum gives live tours, which showcase some of Bouboulina's artifacts and narrates the story of her involvement in the Greek Revolution. Originally from the neighboring island of Hydra, Bouboulina's mother, Skevo Kokoni, sailed in May 1771 to Constantinople while pregnant to visit her husband, Stavros Piniotis, who had been imprisoned there for his participation in a failed pre-revolutionary uprising, the Orlov Revolt. As the legend goes, while in Constantinople, Skevo gave birth to Bouboulina in the prison. Standing in the courtyard of the mansion and hearing this tale, I immediately got the sense that Bouboulina's origin story starts with her equally strong-willed mother and is an attempt or is an apt metaphor for Greece breaking the chains, as it were, of slavery of 400 years of Ottoman occupation. After her husband's death, Skevo remarried a sea captain from Spetses, Lazarou Orlov, and then at the age of 4, they moved to Spetses. As a young girl, she studied with learned priests. She hung out on the docks and sailors and heard exciting maritime stories and probably some folk tales and folk songs. She was encouraged by her stepfather to learn to sail and spent days as the apprentice of the Spetsiot sailors and boat makers. The boatyard in Spetses in the old harbor area is still functioning today, and it's one of the oldest wooden shipbuilding yards in Greece. She married twice, once at the age of 17 to the sea captain Dimitrios Yanouzas, and then again at 30 to another wealthy captain, Dimitrios Bouboulis, from whom she got her name. Both husbands died at the hands of pirates who were known for attacking merchant ships. Widowed twice, she used her massive inheritance to build a fleet of merchant ships and was a successful tradeswoman, adding to her fortune. In 1820, she built the largest flagship of the revolution, the Agamemnon, constructed as a merchant ship to fool the Ottoman authorities, but outfitted in secrecy with 18 heavy cannons. She assembled a crew of young men that she called her palikaria, whom she fed and paid with her own money. You realize that in this very house, Bouboulina met with the most important figures of the time, diplomats from Russia, England, France, ship captains, chieftains, sultans, Philhellenic writers, patriarchs, and members of the Filikieteria, which was the secret society, of course, formed to organize the revolution. There is a painting that hangs in the museum of the Kapitanissa commanding a small boat en route to attack the Ottoman-held fortress at Nafplion. The protagonist, of course, is Bouboulina, her men, her palikaria, or brave young lads, some of them her own sons. She stands with her, grasping her sword at her waist, tucked into her belt, and she stares in profile with her gaze locked on the fortress located just beyond the frame. Her so-called brave falikari cower away from their destination as they row, and around them they're surrounded with smoke and flames and cannon fire from burning boats. Next to the painting hangs a small print of Emanuel Lutz's famous painting of the American Revolution, Washington crossing the Delaware, for comparison. The similarities are striking. Both heroes command their men in one of the most decisive battles of their respective wars. Bouboulina's artist is unknown, as is the date of the painting, but the question remains, did the painter take inspiration from Lutz, or did Lutz base his heroic painting of George Washington on Bouboulina? Bouboulina held court with the most powerful figures of her time, including the Army General Theodoros Kolokotronis, who was not only her military peer, but was actually her in-law, as her daughter, Eleni, was married to the general's son, Panos. In the 1800s, of course, families married for prestige and wealth, not for love. So this is a real testament to her level of importance. Bouboulina's circle included the Ottoman Sultan and his mother, the Valide Sultana, who probably at that time was the most powerful woman in the world, Tsar Alexander I and Ambassador Stroganov from Russia, members of the Filikieteria, and the rebel priest Papa Flesas, who came to Spetses in 1818 to organize the revolt. She raised the flag of revolution on her flagship in the Spetses harbor and declared war against the Ottomans and sailed into key battles at Tripoli, Argos, Pylos, Nafplion, and Monemvasia, leading the Greek navy and even going ashore in some of the legends on horseback to participate in the bloody battles. She did all of this at a time when women's roles were confined to that of wife, mother, or concubine. And in the early 19th century, women were also not educated. They didn't have in public life, and certainly no woman was expected to take up arms and join a revolution as a fighter. At the outbreak of the war in 1821, Bouboulina was 50 years old and the mother of 10 children. So I was overwhelmed by Bouboulina's story. As a Greek woman, I was left wondering, how did I not know about this incredible woman? There's so much to know about her. What was she like? What motivated her? What was it like to live in her times? And as a Greek American who had heard her name whenever a powerful woman was referenced, but like many did not know her story, I was fascinated by the events in her life and her wide-reaching legacy. As a feminist, a Greek, and a researcher, I felt a calling to make her story known to a wider audience, both within and outside of Greece. So in 2005, I completed a doctoral dissertation at the University of Maryland, which included the making of a documentary film about Bouboulina's life. The seeds of that research, as I continue to reflect, what I've learned since that has refined my thinking, and my ongoing interactions with Bouboulina's family on the island of Spetses have become the subject of my ongoing research. The film is part of a Greek-American Diaspora community remembrance project that aims to celebrate important historical women from Greece by telling their stories. And the goal of the series is to bring to the forefront the important contributions that modern Greek women have made to history and to preserve, collect, and interpret their lives in the context of the time and the place in which they lived. Other subjects include Natalia Mela, who is an acclaimed Greek sculptress and the artist who actually sculpted the Bouboulina statue in Spetses, Leila Karagianni, a Greek spy during the Nazi occupation of Greece in the Second World War, and Bouboulina's third-generation granddaughter, unbelievably, and Eleni Altamura, Greece's first female painter, and the subject of Rea Galanakis' award-winning book, Eleni or Nobody, that some of you might know. Is that Dan? Is Dan okay?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Dan, can you mute yourself, please?
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay, just checking on you. Okay, so women, war, and the national narrative. One of the challenges of celebrating Bouboulina as a feminist icon is her relationship to violence and war. In her book, Arms and the Woman, Margaret Poulos investigates the unstable relationship between Greek nationalism and viewed through the image of the female warrior. She recognizes that reconciling war and feminism requires situating a feminist discourse about Bouboulina within an uncomfortable discussion of gender and militarism. As a feminist, I'm aligned with a particular strand of feminism that is staunchly anti-war, anti-militarist. This view opposes the military for its use of violent diplomacy and associates that violence precisely with the military's culture of masculinism and sees militarism as an impediment to justice and peace. Early American feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Jane Addams, as well as their Greek contemporaries like Kalogeropoulos, aligned themselves with pacifist movements. How then to glorify a figure such as Bouboulina, who not only extolled militarism, but actively participated in some of the most horrific events of the war that including the killing of women and children, rape, and thievery? Should women traditionally excluded from roles in politics and decision-making in male public spheres be lionized for making progress in those areas, or be critical of those institutions and instead work to end them? On September 11th, 1821, Tripoli fell to the Greek forces, followed by a 3-day massacre and looting at the hands of the Greeks, with some accounts listing over 30,000 slaughtered. But the battle was halted for several days when Bouboulina went in to advocate for the women and children of the harem to be freed prior to the start of the massacre. She knew this would be a gruesome scene for the women and their families. Kalogeropoulos uses the story of Bouboulina's saving of the harem women and children of the Pasha's harem to show that there is a natural fusion between women's humanity and their coexistent capacity for warfare. What was revolutionary about Bouboulina was not only that she participated in the war, but how she led, with a humanist and feminist consciousness that wouldn't have a language until Perrin theorized it, using Bouboulina herself as the example over 60 years later. Bouboulina died not gloriously in battle, as you would expect, but at the hands of a fellow Speziot. By 1825, she had spent all of her fortune on the war and was quite poor. Her son Grigorios had fallen in love with Evgenia Kourelis, the daughter of a much richer family who was already promised to someone else. The couple eloped and hid in the Yanuzas house where Bouboulina was staying after her political exile from Nafplion. The Kourelis family arrived to retrieve the girl, enraged, and an argument ensued. When Bouboulina leaned out of an open window to shout at them, she was struck by a bullet in the forehead and instantly died. As it was dusk, the name of the killer has never been identified. There was a trial that took place in Nafplion, but there was no definitive guilty party, and so the case was thrown out. The silence around her death makes sense, though, given that some of the authorities who would have overseen the hearing were the same people who wanted her silenced in the first place. Because of her association with Kolokotronis, who had been imprisoned by his adversaries during the civil war that erupted in 1824, and her own opposition to the foreign rule that were vying for leadership of the emerging nation, Bouboulina was considered an enemy of the state. Other examples of women of the Greek Revolution who suffered the violence of the Greek state, just a few. Mando Mavroyenou, the heroine from Mykonos, who was the only woman to reach the rank of army commander. She died destitute after spending all of her fortune on the war and being publicly discredited after Prince Dimitrios Ypsilantis rescinded a marriage promise. Domna Visvisi, together with her husband, donated money and property to the cause. She also commanded a warship, Kalomira, with a crew of 160 men and 16 cannons. She died destitute on the streets of Alexandropoli. Asimnia Gora, the wife of the general who was commander of the Greek garrison in Athens, became a member of the acting committee of the Acropolis. She assumed command until she was replaced. She was eventually killed when part of the Erechtheion was collapsed after the bombing of the Ottomans. Marios Zarofopoula worked as a spy for Kolokotronis and Ypsilantis in the Peloponnese and financed several missions. She was also involved in a crucial event where she protected the secrets of the Filikieteria after they were exposed to Turkish authorities in Constantinople. She died isolated and unmourned and was soon forgotten. Elizabeth Mutsan, who wrote about the domestic slavery of women and published and translated many publications. She railed against the institution of marriage, and she yearned to take up arms for the revolution, but was forbidden by her father and brothers. She finally acquiesced, marrying and giving birth to a son, and she died 10 days later from complications of childbirth. Evanthia Kari, Konstantina Zacharia, the list is long. So someone asked earlier, maybe this is an answer to that question, how can the parade be more radicalized and what can we include? Maybe it's time for, instead of Kalogeropoulos on his horse, we see some of these women represented in the parade. We could talk about that later. Other historians, such as Evdoxios Doxiadis, have argued that the transition from Ottoman to independent Greece, things actually got worse for women. So while Bouboulina's story is energizing on a universal level, and she is an inspiration for Greek women and Greek women of the diaspora in particular, because she provides a shared sense of identity and pride. After all, she was a woman who defied the odds and challenged how womanhood was defined in the 19th century. But many of the barriers she broke are still in place for women today. If you look at Greece today, just in the last 9 months, there have been 12 high-profile femicides in Greece. That is, women who have been murdered at the hands of their husbands, boyfriends, male family members, or neighbors. The Caroline Crouch case is probably the most publicized of all of those. So clearly, Greece still has a problem with violence against women, which stems from not recognizing their full humanity. Another example of the struggle over the meaning of 1821 was literally played out on an image of Bouboulina on the streets of Athens in 2021. For the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the revolution, Yannis Konstantatos, the mayor of an Athens municipality, commissioned a young graffiti artist named Evritos to spray paint a street mural with portraits of the heroes of 1821 along a lengthy concrete wall. When it was made public that the mayor and Evritos himself had ties to the neo-Nazi political group Golden Dawn, and that Evritos's previous work contained Nazi, Islamophobic, and conspiracy theories and called for acts of violence against minorities, the portraits were vandalized with counter graffiti. Bouboulina's mouth was marked with a frown of disapproval, Kolokotronis' eyes were blackened, and Papaflessas had his face marked out. The counter graffiti was a way for taking the vocabularies of resistance and revolution back from the right, who had reappropriated them to serve a nationalistic viewpoint, which had nothing to do with the original historical positionings of figures like Bouboulina and Kolokotronis. So this brings me to my final point, which is about the version of nationalism that resulted from Neo-Hellenic Romanticism, which won Greece's freedom, has been used as a rhetorical strategy of the Greek conservative right wing to justify its puritanical ideology. As Anna Karakatsouli observes, the final outcome of the Civil War and the severe repression of the left during the following decades eclipsed the debate of 1821 in the public sphere, and the Greek Revolution was incorporated into the official authoritarian state ideology. And several of the presenters from this morning also remarked on this. From the War of Independence to the Metaxas dictatorship to the junta, the rise of the Golden Dawn, the anti-immigrant rhetoric of 2015's refugee crisis, the conservative reinvention of history, and the rise of the anti-democratic and right-wing thinking has used the rhetoric of 1821 and the continuity of classical Hellenism as right-wing propaganda. Contemporary interpretations of the war have been twisted so that its meaning changed from a radical rebellion that was based in progressive, humanistic Enlightenment ideas to a xenophobic, anti-Turkish, anti-Islamic, anti-communist, and androcentric conservative views. The dictatorship emphasized fatherland, religion, family, and the slogan Greece for Christian Greeks. Today, there is a direct thread in the rhetoric of contemporary conservatives that can be threaded or drawn through their use of the famous Spartan slogan Malon Lave, uttered by King Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae to the ousting of the Ottomans in 1821. It's used by the Golden Dawn to the QAnon and conspiracy theorists who support Donald Trump in the United States. They use the slogan on everything from t-shirts to bumper stickers to coronavirus masks. Thus, the masculinist rhetoric of the Greek ultranationalist employs an ideological use of 1821 to create distortions and false historical memories in order to legitimize xenophobia, and position the far right as the sole authentic defender of the national past. They use a secondary narrative that better suits their worldview. That particular brand of Greek American pride, which manifests itself in Independence Day parades, flag waving, and church gatherings, teeters on a version of nationalism that embraces militarism without questioning the familiar narratives of the cross versus the crescent, ripe as it is with xenophobia and the rendering of Christian Greeks freeing themselves from the yoke of 400 years of slavery from the Ottomans. According to Greek American studies scholar Georgos Anargostou, the Greek Americans assimilated into American society and became white ethnics. They enacted a politics of forgetting and a kind of social amnesia which idealized the national and marginalized alternative national affiliations. He says groups like AHEPA project a visual embodiment of political and cultural Americanness. Following Foucault's model of visuality, displays and the seeing of displays are not natural processes, but practices associated with power relations. The conformist displays of American Hellenism make visible to the public that AHEPA had arrived in American modernity. The construction of American Hellenic identity, therefore, relied on the forgetting of those aspects of a radical Greek past and a projection of nationalist ideologies that align with conservative American values. So in conclusion, I'll say that as we celebrate the founding of modern Greece and Greek America, it's important to consider how the diaspora chooses to present the history of the homeland. The project of decolonizing gender in this study reminds us that the rebellious spirit of the Greek youth who oppose globalization, the inequities of capitalism, who reject nationalism, and who work to make Greece a more inclusive and diverse country are Bouboulina's sons and daughters and immigrant stepchildren. The culture wars in Athens around the Bicentennial demonstrate how 1821 is still today a contested space and how dangerous the rhetoric of militant nationalism can be and how slippery a slope it is to venerate heroes without critical perspective on the complexities of history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, April, for your personal journey as a proud Greek American researcher, asking feminist questions and reflecting also on this dangerous rhetoric of nationalism, which used Bouboulina and the Greek Revolution to justify xenophobia, as you just showed us. Thank you so much. This was very good food for thought, and I hope that we will be able at some point to all of us to see your film. The time flies. I will give only a couple minutes for some questions. Our first speaker, Dan Georgakas, had an accident and he cannot be now with us. So if we have questions only for now for Kostis and April. Yorgo, I see you have your raised hand.
Yes, I do. Thank you. This is a question for Professor Kalogeropoulos Householder. Thank you for this gender dimension, questions about decolonizing, remembering, and in many ways expanding, challenging dominant narratives. I have a question that is not directly related to your talk, but it is about the topic of your talk. And I saw that the Hellenic American Women's Council organized a conference in Spetses about the Greek women heroines, including Bouboulina. So I was wondering whether you were involved in it, if you know about the narratives there, if there were any interventions, or is this a narrative that reproduces in many ways the dominant narrative of Greek heroism and now inserting women to kind of supplement this narrative?
I was supposed to speak at that conference, in fact, but because of I have a 6-year-old son who's not vaccinated for COVID, I decided not to join. But they did collaborate with the museum, with Pavlos Bouboulis, who is Philip's son. Unfortunately, Philip passed away 3 years ago, and his son Philip has taken over leadership of the museum. And so they were very progressive in terms of making the conference about women's histories. They had a live performance of a play by a woman playwright. And I haven't heard what the feedback yet was, but I think it was very well received. And the fact that they chose to actually do it in Spetses, I know one of the other presenters talked about, this sort of return to Athens for some of the commemorations. I think that speaks volumes in terms of how seriously they took setting this this conference in Bouboulina's island. But yeah, I did know about it. I wish I could have been there.
Yeah, thank you.
Nick and Fevronia. Nick, can you, yes, unmute?
Yes, yes. Hi, April. Thank you for the presentation, and of course, Kostis, thank you very much for your presentations. I hope Dan is getting better. Growing up, April as Greek American is something I didn't mention to my presentation, but is a whole thing regarding the Miss Independence, that young Greek American females go to a pageant and they get elected, and it's a whole float with Miss Independence every year. How you experience that, and what is your position on these gender issues regarding the participation of young Greek Americans, females, as Miss Independence to the parade?
I have seen the Miss Independence float. It's always a little bit contradictory because while on the one hand, I think it does sort of insert women back into the narrative and definitely into the visuality of the parade. The sort of rendering of that to me always bordered on like a beauty pageant. And so it's, if there were ongoing conversations, I think someone else mentioned about some of the myths of the war, the Christoskoleo and other things that we could start to reintroduce as really denationalizing some of the things that we teach in the Greek schools, that maybe that pageant would look different. But it's an interesting topic. I'm going to make a note and maybe I'll have something to say more about that later. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. Fevronia?
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for these wonderful and enlightening presentations. I just have a question for Kosti, and it's more of a comment, just wondering if this might play into your research at all. Have you touched upon, and I don't remember in your presentation if you touched upon the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, and the groups that were involved in that, if a HEPA was involved in that, and what the Athens of the South might mean in your work moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the very short answer is that soon after the Chicago World's Fair, the architects realized that they needed to establish schools for American architects to learn about the Greek language. So the American Academy in Rome was established, and then to make a long story short, they also established an architectural fellowship in Athens as an extension of it. And I forget the architect who actually worked on and designed the Nashville Parthenon, but he was one of the fellows of the of that scholarship. So he's a kind of a direct connection to the Chicago World's Fair in some way, and part of the practices of American archaeologists in Greece. Didn't ask the question of the South is. And once again, thank you everyone for being so patient in seeing sort of my first thoughts on this topic. I know there was a lot of ideas, lots of threads that didn't make a very specific argument. The one thing I left out is that the Greek revival in the South played a completely different role. The Greek revival architecture in the South became, in fact, not about abolition, but about celebrating the master's house. The first, although I haven't really worked this well enough yet, but the first Greek Orthodox Church in 1866 in New Orleans was funded by a Greek businessman who was also involved in real estate, and he basically bought the land on which the Greek Orthodox Church was built. But he was not only trading in real estate; he was also trading in slaves. So this is, I think, one of the stories that we need to kind of begin to scratch. And then before the American Civil War, what was the, how did Greek businessmen, especially cotton traders in the South, engage in slavery? So yeah, my story was a little bit different from, I think that telling the story from the South would be very different than telling the story from the North after the Civil War. Yeah.
Yes, Alexander. Yes, thank you.
Great panel. I'm still thinking about Bouboulina's frown, but I have a question for Kostis. I loved the term suburban neo-Byzantinism introduced by Iakovos. I hope you haven't copyrighted it, because I think we're going to use it. And could you say, is this suburban, those Byzantine churches, okay, I'm taking you off on a tangent, but is it the Iakovian era, and do we have a post-Iakovian architectural style, or does the Byzantine stick and Calatrava copies it for St. Nicholas?
That's a great question. I think the first thing I need to say is that during the, I guess, up until pretty much the 1950s, Byzantine as an architectural style of choice for Greek Americans was strictly not an option. It had already been adopted by Reformed Jews. It had been adopted by a number of other groups that were a lot more ecumenical. And therefore, it could never work as a statement of identity. And I think for that result, to give you an example, the typical Greek American church of the early 20th century has two frontal towers that does not exist anywhere in the Byzantine canon, and is very much a kind of connection back to the correct Greek style of architecture, which is not Byzantine. The correct modern Greek ecclesiastical Greek style, which is not based on strict Byzantine models, very intentionally, because the early state wanted to separate itself from the church. So they did not want to have a kind of medievalizing. So therefore, they went back to models of early Christianity that were distant enough and ecumenical enough. Anyway, it's another long story. So Byzantine becomes kind of, enters the discussion among Greece because of the 1930s generation of search to roots after 1922. So I believe that it's in the minds of the reform happens first in Greece. And then by the 1960s, the American church, I think, is almost embarrassed that it's doing all these very diverse, very uncontrolled, very, in my point, much more interesting variations of church architecture. So I think at that point, and I haven't put this whole story together, but I don't know exactly how Iakovos connects himself up with the American School of Architecture, Classical Studies, but W. Stuart Thompson becomes one of his favorites. And as I've recently learned, the Annunciation Church in Philadelphia was the 60s version was going to be commissioned by Stuart Thompson, and there were conversations, but Thompson died right before they started the project. So on the one hand, you have that very correct 12th century Athenian version that I think is coming through official channels. And of course, you have other kind of Hagia Sophia. There's sort of a lot of the tyranny of the Hagia Sophia, which, as many of you know, it's a church that was never imitated by any other Byzantine building. It's kind of the white elephant in Byzantine architecture. To copy the Hagia Sophia would be the first generation to do it, because no one did in the Middle Ages. For some, it's not an open question. So I think on the one hand, you have the Athenian 12th century, kind of endorsed by Iakovos. You have the kind of iconography of the Hagia Sophia, and they only work as these rising objects that have to be conceived in an empty parking lot, seen from the distance, that you drive by, and does not compete with any other stylistic competitors, which in the urban context is inevitable, because you'd have a Jewish synagogue across the street, you'd have an Episcopal church around the corner. So the kind of visual politics you would play in assimilationist, pre-World War, were very urban and different. Yeah, I don't know if that's a long way to say. It becomes official policy, and it replaces the metropolis. So first the metropolis, then the 12th century. But the funny thing is that it's always Athenian models that are being espoused by the whether it's a 1860s or 12th century. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Kosti, we have a question, well, actually a remark for you from Erasmus Katsan. If you're familiar with the Prophet Elias Church in Salt Lake City, this might be another case study of this neo or pseudo-Byzantine style. And he would be interested to see more modern traditional mixes such as that in the Manhattan Church.
Yeah.
Just a remark. And then we have another question by Professor Charles to April about what, but this is more a generic question about if Greeks were pro-Nazis, pro-right, pro-left, where they were politically oriented. But we will leave this question maybe for another time because it's a bigger one and it encompasses more discussion for a different, subject matter. So it is 1:31. We start. Kosti, you have.
Can I say a very quick comment to April's fabulous talk? The one from the annals of kind of the unknown Greek American artist. I just want to share one, in fact, so very quickly, there is a Greek American artist from Louisiana named Linda Benglis, who became really famous because she did a portrait of herself in 1974 for Art Forum of her kind of cross-dressing and holding a gigantic penis in front of her, very much kind of a feminist artist. But the year before 1974, her earlier exhibition, she actually used, actually maybe I'll share that. She used this, let me show this image in her promotion, which all of you might appreciate. Not as in-your-face radical, but her dressing up as a kid, dressing up in a tsolya outfit, and art historians have interpreted as the beginning of using her Greek, using Greek heritage as a form of kind of cross-dressing. Many of her portraits after that were about, blending the male and the female. The story behind this photograph that she used in 1973 is that back in her church in St. Charles, Louisiana, they just ran out of women's outfits. So she just ended up wearing a boy's outfit. And that sort of began her interest in that, in that arena of using, visual elements of cross-dressing. And anyway, I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you for that. I love that. I'm going to follow. Definitely. And there's been speculation about Bouboulina herself. We always see her in these Philhellenic portraits with this long dress and, bodice, very tight. The reality of that was probably very different. And there's been some speculation that she cross-dressed while she was sailing. Obviously, it would have been more comfortable riding a horse without a skirt on. And there are other stories that are emerging of cross-dressing during the war that are really interesting. In fact, Mandot was buried in a lieutenant's outfit, a male lieutenant's outfit, because she was sort of, she requested that. There are others who cross-dressed in order to circumvent, being murdered, and would rather have, been murdered by the Ottomans in a siege rather than taken as a slave. And so they saved their clothes and were very proud of the cross-dressing that they did. And it was a different version of cross-dressing in terms of the politics of now. Obviously, it was about survival and about some other things, but it's a very ripe area of study. And I thank you for that. Linda Benglis?
Linda Benglis, yeah. And there's just, and I continue another some of the kind of radical feminist artists in New York in the 1970s that are not celebrated within the Greek American community, but the artists themselves use their Greek experience as part of their radical kind of art